We now have the privilege of moving into the time of having our keynote speaker. And so I have the honor, the distinct honor of introducing David Lewis-Peart. David is a writer, a speaker, an educator, and a former minister. He was the co-founder and former coordinator of the spiritual arts community, Sunset Service Toronto Fellowship, which is a nonprofit that's since 2012 committed to building bridges, initiating dialogues, and creating spaces for people of all faith and no faith through the arts. Do we need a minute more to kind of just... We actually are scheduled without a break, so if you need a bio break, you can do that. So, thank you. He's contributed to a TEDx talk. He was a speaker for the Ontario School of Arts and Design in Toronto, Canada. And he spoke to his graduate research work on Black sexual minority youth and his concept for the prophetic performance for those moved to the margins. Thank you. In 2017, David was appointed by the Parliament of the World Religions as their co-chair of the Next Generation Task Force, responsible for the youth and young adult programs for the 2018 Parliament that was hosted in Toronto, Canada. David is a recipient of the inaugural Walden New Thought Awards, which recognizes socially conscious leaders making change happen in our world. David has also received a Christopher Hewitt Award for his poetry and was included as a community curator for the 3rd annual Lambda Literary Festival in Los Angeles. So, ladies and gentlemen, David Lewis-Peart.
Calling out the ones who have come before us, both known and unknown, in spirit and in flesh, we lift you. Father, mother, grandmother, sister, and brother, we acknowledge you in this place, in this space, in our minds, we feel you, your energy. It surrounds we invoke you, asking you for guidance in birth and in death, in famine and bounty. The power still remains, Ashe, the power to make things change. Ashe to the water, Ashe to the wind, Ashe to the fire, Ashe to the ground as I kneel down. it can be discomforting to expect to hear something, but don't. To wait on something that just won't come. And it's a large part of how come we spend so much of our lives filling that space with as much as we can in order to just not feel that. A Course in Miracles begins by stating, nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. So in lies the peace of God. But what if this God you hold in mind is the real that's threatened, or the unreal that doesn't exist? I came to New Thought as a teenager, about 16 or 17 years old. It was sort of by happenstance. I had grown up in a fairly religious home. My mother still to this day states that instead of being a nurse, her call had been to go to Bible college, and in her belief, she was disobedient to that call. I recall growing up very much with a minister in my home, for better and for worse, and most often for worse. Like many, maybe some of you in this room, women and mothers who bear the burden of raising families, sometimes on your own, that burden, that weight can take its toll. And for my mother, that toll resulted in her mental health. My mother's respite, my mother's retreat, was religious fervor. It's in that energy that I was reared. And at some time in my adolescence and early childhood, I ended up going into care of the state, where I spent the next 5 years of my life before returning back home. And so it was that early experience of religiosity that sort of had me averse to everything church. And so it was really interesting that one Pride afternoon, the first of my prides, at around 16, I'd come out at 14 to my mother, to her upset. You're David, beloved of God. You're chosen for me. God doesn't make mistakes. I'd spend the next couple of years running around and trying to find my sense of self. And on one Pride Sunday afternoon, I found myself at my first Pride. And in the crowd, I could hear someone saying, "Condoms, condoms, come get your condoms." The voice was familiar. It was my grade 6 math teacher, Miss Bailey. Whom I hadn't seen since middle school a couple years prior. She was a teacher that forever stayed imprinted upon my consciousness. I was 11 years old, the fat black kid in the back of the class reading Star Trek novels. And she saw me and invited me to lunch. And for the rest of the year, I spent my lunch times with Miss Bailey, sharing. She too had been in the care system and had told me to hold on, that there was life after group home and foster home after foster home, that she was a product of that herself. And so at 16 years old, to hear her voice in the crowd after a number of years, it was almost divine. Around about the same time I had dropped out of high school and was spending my time hanging out in the local park with the nomadic kids smoking weed and drinking $3.50 beer that we convinced homeless people to buy us. I was told that I could tell a story, so I'm going to tell you the story. And so it was Miss Bailey, now Roseanne, who was perfectly timed to re-enter my life in a time where I was in transition. And one afternoon, volunteering with Miss Bailey, she had worked for a local aid service organization and had convinced me that given that I wasn't in school, that I might as well help out and volunteer. And she made mention of this church community that a colleague of hers at work had invited her to. She herself actually had never gone. But something about the way that that community sounded, she felt would resonate with me. And one Sunday morning, after a very full Saturday, as was common, I found myself at this church. Interestingly enough, above one of the largest mental health institutions in our city, the Center for Addiction and Mental Health. The irony of the fact that a mind-healing New Thought church above a mental health center wasn't lost on even the 16 and 17-year-old me. But I shuffled my way into a room a lot smaller than this, 100 or so bodies, mostly black, many women, and I found a seat at the back of the room. And at the front of the church, a handsome gentleman stood, and they began their service as the choir sang and the organist played, and he began with saying, "God is not a man in the sky, but a presence and a power that permeates all things. Omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, everywhere present, equally distributed." That means wherever you are, however you are, God is too. And if God is perfect, God is whole, and God is complete, then that means that wherever you are, just as you are, you're perfect, you're whole, and you're complete. And the choir began to sing, "Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God." And I sat in the back of the church and I listened. And as was the custom at this particular church community at the time, they asked all the newcomers to stand up before the service began. And this room full of black women, many of whom were quite like my mother, lifted their hands and they said in unison, "We love you, we bless you, and we thank God for you." And I sat in the back of that church and a feeling washed over me. And tears began to fall down my face, and I cried an ugly cry in the back of that church. And the walk home that afternoon after the service, I could swear that the birds were chirping louder and the sun was shining brighter. And all of life was responding to this new realization in me that I and God, this God I'd never heard of, were a majority. And I was big. Now, mind you, I still had many full Saturday nights, but my Sundays, found me at church and found me reading and devouring these texts that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, introducing me intimately to this new understanding that was so needed at that time in my life. If the early story had been that all of life was against me, that all circumstances were conspiring for my end, the new story was that I had a co-pilot, and that together we were doing something good. And that energy, that realization gave life. I went back to school. I completed high school, and with the help of Miss Bailey, I got myself some scholarships and got into college, where I studied, funnily enough, mental health counseling. And I began a really full life and career. Now, that's the story that I'm very used to telling. The other part of the story that I don't often tell as much is that in the last year of college, a mature student in my program, an older gentleman from Eastern Europe, one of the most favored kids in our students rather, in our class, one morning we woke up to a news announcement that this loving, caring gentleman, whom we'd all come to know quite well over the years in our program, had apparently, over the course of the weekend, gone home one evening and, in front of his children, killed his wife. And something shook. And then, some months after, a friend, someone whom I had come to know, lost his life due to gun violence. And I shook. But with all of these new teachings and information that I've been afforded over the couple of years with this New Thought community, I leaned deeper into my spiritual practice, deeper into my readings, deeper into the teachings. I picked it up with a fervor that, funnily enough, probably mirrored my own mother's. I began a career in social work, made somewhat of a little name for myself in the city that I'm from, traveled, and even went as far as to begin to explore ministry. Started a little community called Sunset Service Toronto. This community had begun really one Sunday morning as we were sat in church, my co-minister and I. And we wondered about what it would be like to be part of a community that could hold the fullness of who we were as people of color, as queer people, as young people, and as people who had Saturday nights including their Sundays, right? And so we began a process of doing workshops around the city, talking about faith, talking about identity. And we were invited one Pride in 2012 to hold a panel on faith. And we were like, another panel. Another panel, no. How about we hold a revival? And we'll hold it at sunset. And we'll put out an invitation to folks all over to come, and there'll be music and poetry and dance and prayer. And everybody is welcome. And then that sunset in 2012, 150 people showed up at Banquet Hall in the center of town and worshiped with us. And at the end of the service, a lineup of folks asking when the next service would be held. Now, we didn't plan on doing this service, so to think about doing future services was, but we sat with it and we prayed on it. And we were called to, at the time, hold these services each quarter. And so we began. Stuff started to happen in each of our lives. Some really intense things were happening in community. A well-known social worker in the LGBTQ community was found having committed suicide. My co-minister had lost a friend through a car accident. My relationship was coming to an end with my husband and partner, and we were going through it. And so it downloaded to me that we needed to hold space for all those others who are likely going through it, right? If it's true for me, maybe it's true for somebody else too. Especially those of us who've been tasked with holding space for other people, right? There's this lie that's told that we have it all together, but many of us know that that's not the truth. And so we said, let our next service be just for that. And so we called it When the Rainbow Is Not Enough, based on the writings and play, When the Rainbow's Not Enough for Black girls who've considered suicide. And we gathered together in a small little bookstore on Young Street. And 200 folks showed up in this tiny little room. And we had folks from the Muslim community and the Jewish community, and we had our elders there, our spiritual sisters who held the space for us. We invited counselors to make sure that there was someone to be able to hold whatever might come up for folks. And so we began. And our first guest was a good friend of mine from high school who had gone off to study theology, a biracial young woman who identifies as Jewish. And she told the story of her relationship with her father, her grandfather rather, her Jewish grandfather, and how he had recently passed and how challenging that had been for her, because she had both loved this man whom she had known, obviously, since she was a child, but also felt a lot of conflict around, because he was also one of the first experiences she had of anti-blackness, anti-black racism. She shared this beautiful story about her interesting and complex relationship with her grandfather, and she ended off with a beautiful Hebrew prayer. The choir got up and began to sing. And then in the back of the crowd, somebody started to cry. One of them ugly cries that I was speaking earlier about. And I looked around frantically for my elder women and tried to maneuver folks to support whoever this was, because I couldn't see them. And one of our elder sisters went to the back of the room and got hold of this person crying, and they stood up. And I realized that it was the therapist that I had brought in to support the room. I couldn't make this stuff up even if I tried. And so the elder sisters brought him up to the front of the room, and through sobs, he ended up telling us a story about the fact that the service that he was in at the moment was 1 year to the day of the death of his father. His father that he had had an extremely close relationship with in his home country. His father that he had left his home country to study in Canada, and whom he had been avoiding for the last couple of years of graduate school, as he came to recognize that he was LGBT. And then as he closed towards the end of school, he made a commitment to himself that he would call his father and arrange to go back home to have the conversation with him that he had so desperately wanted to have. And that same very day, he got the phone call that said that he had died suddenly. And so he tells the story of going back home, instead of to have the conversation, to bury his father. And how he had scribbled out on a piece of paper everything that he had intended to say to his dad. And as they were throwing in the last bits of dirt, he folded up that note and threw it in with the casket. You could have heard a pin drop as he shuffled off the stage. And then one by one, like fell dominoes, the room begins to erupt into tears. Remember, I started preaching all of like yesterday. So a room full of 150, 200 crying people is not necessarily the way that one wants to begin one's career. But what happened after all the tears was a slew of folks coming to the mic to offer testimony. Someone else had lost a father. Someone was going through a diagnosis of cancer. Another person was a long-term survivor with HIV. Another person had ended their relationship. And one by one, people began to share. And when we ended off the service, people stayed around and talked and hugged. And I remember looking across the room at my co-minister, and we had this realization. We didn't even have to say words, that what we had created was exactly what was needed for this moment in time. In all of our unsurety and all of our naivete and all of our youth, that it was exactly what was needed at this time. And it was wonderful. It was wonderful. Until it wasn't for me. This ever-present sense of unsureness, lingering just at the peripheries. My mother invited me to go back with her to England, where my mother grew up. It had been 10 years since she had been back, since my grandfather had passed. I decided that I'd go along with, begrudgingly. But I went back with my mother, and it was an interesting experience. But what was most interesting was that we had ended up at a church that my mother had felt called to go to. My mother was often led by these calls. I could never tell when it was the mental health or what it was. And we laugh, but it's true. Right? But anyways, I ended up with my mother at this church that she had felt led to go to. And we sat in the service, a black Pentecostal church, and a mad woman was running up and down the aisles. No, that's not very politically correct, but it was true. She was. And my mother interestingly enough, was like, I'm going to pray for her. I said, okay, you pray. But as the service began, the minister stood up and tried to shush the congregant that was having a moment. And he said, today is an amazing day. We just want to acknowledge a local sister of ours of this church. She's recently won a prestigious award offered up by the city of Manchester. And as part of this award, she will be able to go about and do her work and research around mental health and black communities that she's been engaged in for the last number of years. Dr. Edge is doing some amazing groundbreaking work. And as part of this bursary that's been afforded to her, her first stop will be in Canada. And so my mother turns to me and she says, see? See, God? And so at the end of the service, I end up going back to the back of the church where they would feed the children. And I tried to get a hold of Dr. Edge's attention. And she was very busy and flustered. And I said, Dr. Edge, I just wanted to introduce myself to you. My name is David. I'm from Canada, from Toronto, from the same city that you'll be going to. And actually, my background is in mental health. And I do work in black communities. And I'm super interested to get... And she's, okay, yeah, uh-huh. All right. And as I'm ending this conversation with Dr. Edge, I hear, in the back of the church, and it's my mother. My mother bumped into her father's best friend, Mr. Williams. She goes, David, come, it's Mr. Williams. And so she introduces me to this frail little black man with beautiful skin. And she goes, David, this was my father's best friend. They knew each other back in Jamaica, and they came over. Oh my God, Mr. Williams, how old are you? You must be at least 95? 95. And as we were sitting around talking, a young woman comes in and taps Mr. Williams on the shoulder and goes, "Daddy, give me the keys to the car." And he hands her the keys to the car and she shuffles off. And my mother says, "Car?" He says, "Yes." She goes, "You still drive?" He goes, "Yeah, I still drive." And I cook Sunday dinner and I'm, beautiful, right? Beautiful moment, whatever. I go back home to Toronto, to Canada, and I can't stop thinking about England. Can't stop thinking about England. And I get a phone call. This is a couple months after, and it's Dr. Edge. And she goes, "I'm in Toronto. And I was supposed to have meetings with such and such this professor and such, and none of it has worked out. And I remembered that you lived here. I wanted to reach out to you." I said, "Sure. Let's meet for lunch." I said, I'll take her to the CN Tower, which is our sort of thing that we're known for. More recently, Drake and the Raptors. So I meet Dr. Edge for lunch. We go to the CN Tower. And she said, "Strangest thing, David. I'm at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, where I'm to meet with such and such a psychiatrist, such and such a professor, and nothing's working out. And one of the colleagues there, a professor, turns to me and says, I'm sorry that nothing's worked out, but maybe we can connect you with somebody else." And she goes, "Well, what do you mean?" "Well, there's a number of people doing interesting work. Have you heard of someone named David?" She goes, "I'm meeting him for lunch." We end up meeting for lunch and having conversation. By the end of the conversation, I made the decision that I'm going to do my PhD and I'm going to move to England. I drop everything with the intention of going to England. I'm going to spare you all the boring details of this story. Long story short, I didn't get the scholarship to the program that I had been admitted to. And I didn't even have a place to live or a job. And I called Dr. Edge. And she goes, "I put out a word at church. And there's someone that is renting out their house. And they're willing to take you on as a tenant if you're willing to live with them." I said, "Sure." I said, "I bought a one-way ticket. I've sold my house. I've left my partner at the time, and I'm headed. I don't know. I feel called." And I arrive in England and end up heading down to this new residence that I'll be living in, and the door opens, and there's a black woman with her head wrapped. It's a very nice neighborhood, so I'm sort of surprised to see a black woman opening the door. It's the reality, right? It's reality. That whether it's England or the US or Canada, race plays a factor in where and how you live for so many folks. So I was taken aback by this beautiful black woman who opened the door. She shuffles me in, and she's showing me around the house, and she's flustered, and she's going off somewhere. But her face looks so familiar. I think I know you. No, I don't know you. No, I think I know you. No, I don't know. I feel like I know you. And she goes, "No, I don't know who you're talking about." And she leaves, and I'm putting away my stuff. By the evening time, she returns, and she goes, "So I went to church, and after church, I went to my father's house for Sunday dinner, and I told him about my new tenant. You're David Lewis, Shernette's son. My father is Mr. Williams. You were the lady that came asking for the keys a year before." And she goes to me, This is so interesting." I said, "Is it?" She says, "It's almost divine." I said, "Is it?" You see, my grandfather was part of what was called the Windrush. So in 1953, my grandfather and many other Jamaicans had moved from the islands to England. During the times where they used to hang signs on doors that said no Jews, no blacks, no dogs, and no Irish. My grandfather worked and worked and worked and worked and worked his way up. as a conductor on the railway or the buses or the something when they needed conductors. And saved up enough money to buy a house. And after he bought the house, he sent for some of his friends back in Jamaica. And the friend that he sent for was Mr. Williams. And Mr. Williams lived in that house until he had a family of his own. My homeless behind now lived in the house of the youngest daughter of the man who lived in my grandfather's house in 1953. So I'm getting goosebumps even as I tell it to you now, yeah? But this was back, I was called. And so that was the energy that I was moving with for the first number of months. See how the universe works, conspires for your good. You see how good God is. God is good. Until month number 3. Until month number 3. And the waves of loneliness and isolation began to hit me. And the realization that all of my knowns, all of my familiars were no longer at hand. And it's easy to claim and to name things as being divinely ordered when things are in order. But when you are alone and you're standing in nothingness, and where the crutches that you used to be able to lean on are no longer there, all of a sudden you're aware of just how much discomfort. And I'd spend the next couple of months really moving through an experience of depression. But I was reading a lot and listening a lot. And it was also during the time where there was the issues around fundamentalist violence, both in France and in the US. And I was seeing what religiosity and spirituality looked like at its extremes, right up close. Funnily enough, I was still studying and taking a course in ministerial counseling, and one evening I was on the phone with my lecturer, and we were going over the coursework, and he'd asked me if I had read the readings. I said, yes, I read the readings, and I said, God is love. He said, you don't know that. I said, yes, I do. I do. No, you don't. No, but I do. No, you don't. To this day, I whether he'll take it or not, Reverend Ken Gorman, really I credit for this moment of interruption. And he goes, you read it. You might even believe it, but you don't know it. And I was not too pleased with Reverend Gorman. No, really, I wasn't. And I said, well, why would you be teaching a thing that you're telling me that I don't? Like, this is ridiculous. What are you talking about? Now, mind you, outside of just my formal training, that since 17, I've been informally leaning into these teachings. My landlady was and is a more conservative fundamentalist Christian, and we would often get into dialogues. She's also a lawyer, and so we'd often get into dialogues. And we would go back and forth, and, about the woo-woo God that she thought I believed in and the real God that she believed in, right? And so each morning I would read something from my daily word, and she'd read something from one of her biblical readings, and we would, go toe-to-toe. Anyways. One morning she, felt called to read me a particular passage that had been in her readings, and she began to share this with me, and I've always obliged, and she ended up sharing this reading that started out really good. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it started out good. It sounded good. But it devolved into something a little scary. It was something about stoning your daughter or something, I don't know. Like, really. And I said to her, I said, no, finish, please, finish. And she goes, no. I said, finish. She goes, you don't understand. I said, what don't I understand? She says, context. I said, context. She's like, well, in those times it was, I said, so in those times, stoning your daughter was okay. So there were truths that were true at one time that aren't, okay, all right. I just want to be clear. Now, what's interesting is my arrogance, my haughtiness. And she called me on it. So you're this... this presence, power thing that isn't a thing, but it exists, but it exists in you, and it is... Now remember, I was raised in a home with a woman who should have been a minister, so I can go toe-to-toe with any... Bring it. But one of the things, it's likely due to her training in law, was their ability to dissect. And by the end of that morning, and she found it, she said, see, you don't know what you think you know as well as you think that you know it. They say some people are hard-headed, I am. And so what I've tried to, in this sort of hodgepodge of a story, illustrate for you is how knocks come. And how you'll ignore the first one, and you'll ignore the second one. And so now I'm at a Marvia Providence concert some months after. Marvia Providence, for those who likely don't know, is a gospel singer in Jamaica. Very, very popular. And growing up, I would hear her music often. And she has a song that I still am a big fan of. When my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. That is higher than I. But it's said like Jamaicans do it. So they don't do it like that. That's almost like the sort of Anglican version. The Jamaican... Thou hast built a shelter for me and a strong tower from the enemy. When my heart is overwhelmed, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. So I'm in this church in the middle of England, at this Marvia Providence concert, and everyone is clapping and singing, and I'm singing and I'm feeling it. And then I look around the room. I look around the room and I see an elderly mother with her adult daughter with developmental delays. I see a young mom with 5 children, all under the age of 7. I see a young man who looks like he probably just left some kind of community that might be involved in things that are less than awesome. And I began to see the church filled with folks needing a rock. And a light bulb went on in me, and I realized that I wasn't separate and apart from anyone in that room. That 16-year-old that ended up in the back of that church, and the 7-year-old, and the 21-year-old, that I was searching for the same thing too. And that in my arrogance, I might look down on folks like my landlady, or in my horror, I might look on those folks who are blowing themselves up in crowded rooms. But all of us shared one thing in common. We thought that faith was a holding on to a rock. We thought it was a grasping at something outside of ourselves. We confused the believing for the knowing. We all got a call. Different numbers, same call. And it was like, I would say it was like a light bulb going off, but it was more like a bomb. have to understand, the God that I knew was angry and jealous and judging. The God that I found in the back of that church that Sunday afternoon was a God of relationship and forgiveness. But the reality was that both were stories that were incomplete and partial. That I had moved no further along than the 10-year-old in the back of Miss Bailey's class. I just bought into a different story. And I found my way back home in Canada and struggling. I don't know if folks in this room, because you all seem really holy, I don't know if you've known what it's like to lose your faith. To doubt all the things that got you to this place and time. It was like a bomb. I talked about the young man, former friend, who passed due to gun violence. What I didn't tell you was that he was murdered in his home by some would-be robbers at a small house gathering that he had. A house gathering that he had actually invited me to. That at the time I was working late. I worked for an anti-violence organization, interestingly enough, doing gender-based violence work. And I got caught up at the office and for years, under my fervor, there was another thing being said. Why not I? And whether I was conscious of it or not, there was a way that I tried to make sense of it. And part of that was this God that I was co-conspired with. And when the bomb went off, I realized how horrid an idea that is. But it allowed me to survive. To think that things happen. That things just happen. To hold that space. Like the quiet at the beginning of this talk. It's uncomfortable. I needed to believe in a God that conspired for my good at all times. I needed to believe in a God that I was in relationship with that was working things out always. I needed that. It allowed me to pull myself up and out of the circumstances that I had found myself in. It allowed me to overcome the things that I saw in my home. It allowed me to create a new story that better served me. But it was still a story. I warned Reverend Ketchum and Debbie that I know that this was supposed to be the inspirational keynote, and I don't know if that is exactly what I came here to do, but the last 3 years, I haven't preached and I haven't teached. I don't know nothing about God. I no longer speak to things I do not know for sure. And I've had to deal with my grief in losing that sense of plantedness in my world and in my experience. I still go to church every Sunday, but it doesn't land quite the same. Meditation is the place that I go to most often. There's something beautiful in being taught to just observe, not to add anything to it. Now, all of us highbrow New Thought folks, we think that we're above all those things, but we don't do that. But we, too, what stories are you walking with that have allowed you to survive? What stories have you walked with that have allowed you to survive? Nobody in this room came to these teachings just because, yeah? Even those of us who like to sort of present this sort of, we do this thing and we wear flowy clothes and we pull out our crystals and we do all kind of foolishness. But all of us, no, it's so interesting because it's been in the absence of God that I have found myself closest to the understanding of the truth. You know that there's one law above all laws, yeah? There's one law. I don't know about all the universal laws, but I do know one law above all laws, that every knee shall bow to and every tongue shall confess eventually. And that's change. That all things are subject to this one force that is present in the universe at all times, that you cannot defeat it. And change doesn't make sense. Change doesn't always feel good. Change will sometimes result in losing, will often, if not always, result in losing. And that's hard. And so our spiritual practices and our religious traditions are all ways of us managing, existing in a universe that is subject to a law that we just can't stand. But if you are truly a religious scientist, if you are a practitioner of spiritual truths, you must be willing to let everything go, and that means even everything that you've come to know to be true. I want to know about what got you here before spiritual mind treatments. I want to know what got you here before affirmative prayer. I want to know what got you here before all of your daily I want to know the truth. I sat at lunch with someone yesterday and they were telling us, how did you come to be a minister? If all of us were honest about the things that drew us to some of the work that we do, we'd have to tell our stories about pain, fear, doubt, grief, anxiety. But you'd never know that to talk to any of y'all. You never know it. Because everything is rainbows and sunshine and light and clouds and love and peace and joy. I was on a talk for the Walden awardees some time ago. And during the interviewer was asking us about, what peace. Asked us about peace. And everyone gave their things about peace and love and peace and love. It came to me, Reverend, tell me about what you know. I said, I know nothing about peace. What I do know is about the absence of peace. And that's what brings my desire. I search for peace because I don't know peace. I came to this community because I didn't have peace. I pray, I meditate because I don't know peace. Truly absent of any fear, doubt, anxiety. I don't know that. I'm sometimes given glimpses, but even then I can't even hold on to that. I don't know peace. I don't know love. Truly. But I'm searching. The antidote to fundamentalism is mysticism. And the true mark of mysticism is the ability to stand in the mystery. I don't care what you've read. I don't care who you taught with or studied under. I don't care what spiritual mind treatments you did on yourself or what pilgrimage you went on. You and I and everybody on this planet have no idea what is going on we woke up this morning. I'm stood here talking to you. I have no idea the millions of things that are organizing themselves to do that. I'm not conscious of any of that. I don't know. And if I can barely know what's happening on my pinky toe, why would I know about... So I no longer speak to things, and I find it interesting that we go and we speak to things that we truly know that we don't know. Now, then the question, why are you here? Because I can hear your thoughts. I used to do a lot of that too back in the day. But no, I can't hear your thoughts, but I can hear mine. And if it's true for me, then it's true for at least some of you. What is the purpose of spiritual community? It's not to provide pat answers or false and incomplete answers. It's to provide community, the space to hold each other in the grayness of life. It is not to provide false answers. We don't know. We don't know. We believe, we hope, we wish, we desire, but we don't know. But we're called to be witnesses. You see, I'm telling a story about my life and my fall, right? My walk through, and somebody will go, oh, I'll pray for him. And I've had people say that to me. The ones who haven't gotten really upset, I've had people be very upset with me. Felt that I've deceived folks for all these years in my career, my work. But I'm being called to be a witness to other people in their stuff. I can't be a witness to your stuff if I can't be a witness to my own. I can't be a witness to your doubt if I can't be a witness to my own. I can't be a witness to your unsurety if I can't be a witness to my own. And my call is not to provide pat answers. It's to hold the space for you to stand in the question. Now that will work for some folks. For others, everything that I've said has upset. And I want to offer this. It upset me too. But you know one thing I do believe in, without all the woo-woos and all the gaudy stuff, I do believe this, that life is a mirror. And that life is full of grace. And if you don't hear it today, it'll come tomorrow, or it'll come the day after. But it will come. Reverends, bishops, spiritual mind treatment practitioners, whatever, crystal healers, it will come. It'll come in the phone call that says that you've got cancer. It'll come in the divorce papers that show up at the door. It will come. And you will have to be face to face with the reality that you don't know. But there's a gift in that. There's a gift in that. The early introduction talked about my research, my graduate research with Black youth. One of the things that I wrote about and spoke about was this idea of prophetic performance. The idea of the prophetic performance is just that at some point in all of our lives, sometimes over multiple periods in our lives, we'll be pulled to the peripheries of our experience. And the analogy I give is this idea that, we all began in sort of little tribes and communities, and the closer you were to the fire, the safer you were, the more likely you were to get fed. And so we all have an aversion to edge. We all have an aversion to the peripheries. But each and every one of us will be pulled to that periphery at some point in time. And instead of seeing it in dread, we see it as a gift. That life will always bring you to the edge, bring you to the peripheries, to have you reevaluate what it is that you think that you know about who you are. It's a process of kenosis. It's the flushing out of all ideas of who it is that you think that you are. And in the emptiness, life can actually then speak to you. You can actually receive the beauty and the gifts of life and the people in it, tabula rasa, instead of imparting on it whatever it is that you are hoping for or everything that you are afraid of. You begin to receive life as it is, a constant of happenings that work for your good or for not, or they just are. They just are. And so, the questions that if you come to my workshop later, we'll be discussing. What stories have I learned in order to survive? How and in what ways have these stories played out in my experience? Where are these stories partial or incomplete? What might I need to, but am unwilling to, let go of in order to receive a newer and truer thing? And how will I hold the space and the place of pause before the newer or truer thing arrives? I've been writing a lot since this process of emptying. And so I'm going to share with you 2 poems and I'll get out of people's way. The first one is called This I Pray. I give myself permission to be real, to tell the truth about who I am, where I am, and what I'm walking through at each given moment as I see fit. I give myself permission to be vulnerable, to F up, to change my mind, to evolve. I affirm that I am not a puppet to my past, my culture, my race, any in-group or collective ideal. I'm not beholden to others' opinions about me, good or bad. Both ideas are incomplete anyhow. Binaries are not my reality. I embrace my gray, my messy, my inconsistent, and my crazy. I bless the uncomfortable. I honor myself, recognizing that the foundation of that self that I revere is and will be subject to change. I pray for gentleness along the journey, with others and with this bag of blood and bones I call me most of all. I pray that this gentleness is never about avoidance or shirking of my responsibility to stand and to speak in integrity. Let me never conflate the two. I ask for courage daily, but forgive myself in advance for the many, many times cowardice will take its place. My aim, in the end, is to face this living thing as hard as it can be on the regular, with grace, adventure, humility, curiosity, joy, and compassion as often as I remember. Let my hope be that when my number is called at the end of this all, that I'll have the ability to let go easily, knowing regardless of my failings along the way, I did my best. And this is the poem that is the sort of impetus for the book that I'm currently writing. I began writing this stuff after, again, like I said, losing faith is really hard. And the reality is that part of the way that I dealt with that hardness was through drink. And I made a big fool of myself a couple years ago in a very public way. And it was interesting because I went to one of my spiritual mothers afterwards and I spoke about this. Oh my God, I'm the spiritual person. I made a big old ass of myself in public. And she says, you know what, David? Part of what's been holding you back is your ideas of who it is that you are. And isn't it interesting that life literally pulled the rug from under you, and not only from under you, but in front of as many people as could be witness. So that you never go back again. If there's anything that I can say for anybody, this is if I was to be hit by a bus tomorrow, I want to at least make this known, is that there are so many stories in this room of survival and overcoming and of breaking, covered up in spiritualisms and bypassing and all kinds of, and there are people in this room who are emotionally and spiritually dying because of the camouflage that you've been forced to wear. You came to these teachings to free yourself, and now you've just put yourself in a new prison. I am giving permission to somebody in this room today to be freed. You didn't come here to put on a new cloak. You came here to take them off. But life is good and gracious, so it will give you another opportunity. So this is my last one, and then I'll get out of your hair because I'm sure that I'm over time. Let it fall apart. All of it. Don't rush to pick up the pieces. Let yourself lay out in the mess of you. Let them talk. Avoid the haste to fashion answers. They be false anyhow. Allow the uncomfortable, the feeling, the thrashing. Drink yourself sick if need be. Cry. F till your brains fall out. Dance. Work like a horse. Pray at every altar. Deny yourself too if it serves. Run. Then, when the Savior that you've been chasing hasn't come, and the empty space your sense of you once occupied still remains unfilled, wait. Wait. Patience is less a virtue and more a happening, the one that comes without effort or holy aspiration, earned easier by the whore than to the chaste and to the righteous. Dark gutters and lonely gallows school quicker than any tower bleached ivory. God isn't in the details, but the dirt. Black like absence or stillness, the silence left behind when our prophets and our princes and the imagined man above forsake. There it is. There it has always been. But first, you gotta break. Thank you.
I'm going to get him.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
So I thought, how could I get this spiritual looking dress off before I come back? Quick change with Sean. I want you to know how valuable what you said is, because it's the truth of what we know of ourselves. I was raised in Unity. The stories that I've shared have been broken stories about how life just splays us open, no matter how we may think we have to dress or look. And you, in what you're sharing, is giving all of us permission. And I was with you at the Parliament of World Religions in Toronto. And I've heard you again, and even seen the growth since then. So, needless to say, we value what you have said. We feel it deeply, and it gives us permission. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.